Alcatraz, the Rock, the most infamous prison on Earth.
It was a legendary escape from a place that was supposed to be inescapable. 55 years ago this month, 3 men pulled off the impossible, breaking out of Alcatraz.
The escape was real. The truth? Far more complicated. For over 60 years, the Alcatraz escape mystery haunted the American imagination. No bodies, no confessions, just decoys, a raft, and 3 men who vanished into cold silence. But in 2025, something surfaced, literally, that cracked the case wide open. Did they drown? Or vanish into new lives under new names? Why were authorities so secretive for so long? This isn't just a mystery. It's a warning. We'll break down how the case was reopened, what they found, and the stunning detail that changes everything we thought we knew. The night Alcatraz went silent. It was June 11th, 1962. Just after lights out, a quiet blanket fell over Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary. The night seemed uneventful, almost routine, until it wasn't. Guards patrolled the concrete corridors with trained precision, their boots echoing off cold steel and stone. Behind every locked door, prisoners lay under thin, government-issued blankets. But 3 of those bunks held no living men. Instead, they cradled carefully constructed decoys, dummy heads made from plaster, soap, toilet paper, and real human hair. Silent, lifeless, and disturbingly realistic. The real inmates, Frank Morris and brothers John and Clarence Anglin, were already gone. Months of planning, improvisation, and sheer nerve had led to that very moment. Alcatraz was supposed to be escape-proof, its rocky island location surrounded by the frigid, unforgiving currents of San Francisco Bay. Yet these 3 men had managed to challenge that belief, and for one brief, breathless moment, they were winning. Their blueprint was not wild. Actually, it was methodical, where Frank Morris, the ringleader, had IQ 133 and had an extensive criminal record for bank robbery, escaping from the prison earlier. Intelligent, composed, quietly focused. The Anglin brothers, raised on the rivers of Florida, had strong swimming skills and were determined just like the rest. Each night, the trio would chip away at the back walls of their tiny cells using stolen spoons and a motor fashioned from a vacuum cleaner. It was hidden every morning with a pivotal vent grating held in place with toothpaste. A service utility corridor was conveniently located behind the barrier walls. It was right here they released themselves for private and gained entry to a well-known makeshift workshop located above the prison block. They had sewn more than 50 stolen raincoats into an inflatable raft and life jackets to be used for escape. Their escaping tools were crude, but they worked. A stolen accordion was converted into a bellow that could pump air into the raft. These were not thugs winging it. They were engineers of their own freedom. That night, oh so dark and fog-stuffed as it was, 3 men crawled through a hole just wide enough to fit a man's shoulders. They climbed up a ventilation shaft to the roof of the prison and found no alarms, screams, or guards noticing anything out of the ordinary. They slinked down the drain pipes, across the prison yard, and climbed over 2 barbed perimeter fences before disappearing into the night. By the shoreline, they inflated their raincoat raft. The tide was beginning to shift, and the fog covered everything like a veil. Using the homemade paddles, they pushed off into dark water, disappearing from sight. They had no lights, no compass, no backup. What they had was a raft, a prayer, and a deep desire never to see another prison wall again. Illusion fell apart by morning. While a guard made rounds, he happened to notice something odd. The head in Frank Morris's bed seemed too still. He nudged it, and it rolled onto the floor. Real hair, hollow eyes, fake. Then the alarm went off. The whole prison went on lockdown. Helicopters, Coast Guard boats, and armed patrols descended upon the bay. Inside the cells, the officers found 3 gaping holes whittled down into the back walls. In the utility corridor, makeshift tools and the remnants of their escape workshop sat like a time capsule. On Angel Island, debris began to wash ashore, more fragments of raincoat rubber, a makeshift wooden paddle, and a wallet with photographs that seemed to be of the Anglin family. But no bodies, no confessions. In fact, that would be what the FBI later deemed to be their official position. The men drowned. But one key issue remained. There was absolutely no evidence for either claim. No traceable evidence of death, no confirmed sighting of bodies, and 3 men who have been poo-pooed before now really left the door open for a very chilling possibility. And while federal agents scrambled to close the case, the whispers had already begun. Whispers that would grow louder with every passing year. Ghosts in the current. The official story was supposed to end in 1962. 3 prisoners vanish from the most secure prison in the country and are never heard from again. Case closed. But the waters surrounding Alcatraz didn't stay silent. Almost immediately after the escape, strange reports, sightings, and clues began to emerge, each one whispering the same chilling question: what if they survived? It started with a flicker of possibility. Just 1 year after the breakout, a small newspaper in Brazil reported that 2 American men had been spotted traveling through rural farmland. The article claimed they bore an uncanny resemblance to John and Clarence Anglin. It didn't make headlines in the U.S., but it was enough to catch the attention of U.S. Marshals still quietly monitoring the case. Then, in the years that came along, the Anglin family started to receive unsigned postcards, some arriving at Christmas, but others seemingly at random. Handwritings varied, but some bore enough resemblance to Clarence's for the family to wonder. And every year, without fail, there were red roses on their mother's grave in Florida. No card, no name, just the flowers. The ritual continued for over 2 decades. Whoever left them wanted it to be done out of sight, but they wanted to be remembered. The message to the Anglins was that their brothers were alive. They had gotten away, and they were watching. Rumors thickened in the 1970s when a family friend surfaced with something startling: an old photograph taken in 1975 in Brazil. It showed 2 men standing by a pickup truck in a rural farm. The friend swore that they were John and Clarence Anglin. He claimed that he went to see them, had a meal with them, and swore to keep their secret. The photo lay in a drawer for decades, only circulated quietly by members of the family and investigators, until finally finding its way into the digital age. As the quality of facial recognition software progressed, so too did the opportunities for the image in question to become considered. So when finally, in the early 2020s, AI analysis was applied, the result, a staggering 97.8% probability match for John Anglin and 96.3% for Clarence, turned everything upside down. A scientific validation of what had seemed a blurry hoax. But the FBI refused to acknowledge it. The U.S. Marshals downplayed it. Another jolt hit the investigation in 2010. A letter purportedly written by John Anglin made its way to the FBI, in which Anglin claimed he and his brother had survived the escape, that Frank Morris died in 2005 and Clarence in 2011. The letter's author stated that he was dying of cancer and was ready to negotiate. In exchange for medical treatment, he would give himself up. The letter was not signed, though DNA and fingerprint testing were done on it. The results were inconclusive. However, enough speculation was raised. In point of fact, the case was never abandoned by the U.S. Marshals. In 2020, they even released digitally aged renderings of the escapees and made a public request for any new intelligence. They did not refer to the men as fugitives anymore. Those terms were reserved for persons of interest in a historical inquiry. A quiet acknowledgement. Not even ghosts they did not follow. They were still chasing men. And outside the official lines, the myth only grew. The Reddit forums, the late-night documentaries, and the conspiracy blogs all delved into the mystery. Some argued that the three had died just outside the reach of freedom. Others were certain they had co-conspirators waiting for them on the other side of the bay. A few pointed to contradictions in the evidence. Why had one of the alleged life vests never been discovered? Why did the authorities lock down so quickly if, in fact, they actually believed the escapees had drowned? Over the years, the escape morphed from a crime into legend, fueled by its absence, not evidence. Each unexplained photograph, every cryptic correspondent letter, and every second-hand sighting built myth on rumor until the Alcatraz escape became a kind of American folklore. But if the story was all smoke, why did federal agents never stop looking? And why, even decades later, were they still quietly testing evidence and tracking tips? Tides of evidence. For decades, the debate swirled like the waters around Alcatraz. Did Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers die in the bay, or did they make it to freedom? As public fascination deepened, so did scientific interest. And soon, investigators weren't just dealing with legend, they were dealing with data. The tides of myth would be tested by the tools of science. In the immediate aftermath of the escape, Coast Guard boats and helicopters swept the bay. On June 12, 1962, just one day later, debris was discovered floating near Angel Island. A makeshift paddle, pieces of a life jacket, and a wallet that allegedly contained family photographs of the Anglin brothers. The assumption was grim: cold water, strong currents, darkness, and a barely functional raft. Everything pointed to a failed attempt. The FBI leaned on that narrative. By 1979, they had officially closed the case, stating that the men had most likely drowned. But the U.S. Marshal Service never bought it. The case remained open as investigations were quietly pursued, with every ounce of physical evidence stored: pieces of the raft, garments, retrieved items from the water. They did not publicly announce their intentions, but they were waiting for science to catch up with that moment. The 2000s were that moment. In 2003, the cast of Mythbusters attempted to recreate the escape from the island using period equipment and authentic tide data. Their conclusions? It was possible. With precise timing and pure luck, the raft might have made it across the open channel to the Marin Headlands. The experiment astonished audiences and rekindled interest. Suddenly, survival did not seem that far-fetched. 9 years later, a group of Dutch researchers from Delft University of Technology intensified the investigation. They undertook an extensive tidal simulation, integrating high-resolution mapping with historical weather data and fluid dynamics modeling. Their conclusion? Should the escapees have launched their raft sometime between 11 p.m. and midnight, the very time frame investigators believe, they stood a fair chance of getting to Horseshoe Bay. This study profoundly undermined the "they drowned" hypothesis. Meanwhile, suddenly, the erstwhile anecdotal Brazil photograph assumed more significance. In 2020, a private forensic lab subjected it to modern AI-powered facial recognition programs. The results were all but conclusive: a 97.8% probability being John Anglin, 96.3% being Clarence. These were not guesses, but biometric matches based on craniofacial ratios, ear feature shape, and digital age progression. The FBI did not initially want to comment further on its analysis. On the other hand, the U.S. Marshals still kept that photograph in their active case file. Then came the more sensational 2010 letter to the FBI, signed by a supposed John Anglin, claiming that Frank Morris had died in 2008 and Clarence in 2011, while he himself was dying and willing to turn himself in. The letter requested leniency and special consideration for cancer treatment. Experts managed to extract DNA and fingerprints from the letter, but were not able to arrive at a conclusion. Another stroke. Then, in a larger artwork of confusing legacies. A different world opened up in forensic anthropology. Next-generation sequencing of DNA, able to operate on heavily degraded samples, was now the best shot for solving cold cases. AI-supported facial reconstruction, mitochondrial sequencing, and sediment analysis had matured beyond what investigators in the 60s would have ever imagined. By the early 2020s, almost everything was being revisited. Chunks of a raft, paddles, clothing, soil samples from places where debris had floated ashore. This was all under the momentum of a more profound push, not to uphold theories, but to seek the truth. Then something happened that no simulation, no photograph, and no second-hand story could compete with. Cold, irrefutable evidence finally surfaced. The 2025 discovery. In May 2025, the Alcatraz escape mystery that had haunted the public imagination for over 60 years was finally brought to a definitive and heartbreaking close. The announcement came not from a documentary or family interview, but from the highest levels of federal law enforcement. The U.S. Marshals Service, alongside the Department of Justice and California State Parks, confirmed what many had speculated, but few truly believed. The escapees did not survive. Earlier that year, in January, coastal researchers were conducting storm damage assessments near the northeast shore of Angel Island. The previous winter had been harsh. Intense rainfall and heavy tides had shifted sediment across rarely disturbed parts of the coastline. What the researchers found buried in the inlet was unexpected and chilling. 3 sets of human remains discovered together in a long-concealed area, long considered inaccessible. Alongside the skeletons were personal effects, fragments of clothing, pieces of a broken paddle, and most critically, remnants of a rubberized flotation device made from stitched raincoat material, the very same method used in the escapees' makeshift raft. The initial handling of those findings was done quietly. Forensic experts wished to wait until they had full confirmation before releasing any public statements. The remains underwent analysis at a pair of different laboratories. Here, careful work was undertaken in the extraction of mitochondrial DNA, craniofacial reconstruction, and cross-comparison against biological samples previously collected from the living relatives of the Anglin brothers. It was definite. 2 skeletons provided viable mitochondrial DNA with unerring matches to family samples from the Anglin family. The much-damaged, partially intact 3rd set of remains was identified as Frank Morris through dental record comparisons, skull shape analysis, and AI facial mapping software. A 95% match was identified against Frank's Alcatraz mugshot and medical profile. There was little doubt. Not only did the evidence support a compelling conclusion, but conclusively so. The announcement was made by federal officials in a coordinated press conference. Their words were simple and solemn. After careful forensic review, we can now confirm that the men who escaped Alcatraz during the night of June 11, 1962, did not survive their journey. The evidence shows they perished shortly after entering the bay, and their remains were preserved through natural sedimentation until recently exposed by storm-driven erosion. The very mystery which had become a symbol of brazen optimism was now dispelled. The remains of Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin were returned to their families. There would no longer be any criminal action against them. The fate of all 3 escapees had been officially declared for the first time by the federal government. It was a revelation that brought down the curtain after decades of speculation. Conspiracy theories, secret lives in Brazil, letters from beyond the grave, and decades-old photographs were all officially closed chapters. The forensic evidence was not just a conclusion, but a reset of history. Everything believed to be true was now measured against a final indisputable fact. The men didn't make it. Historical tide and weather data was reanalyzed. According to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, if the raft failed just off the coast of Angel Island, a scenario supported by the location of the remains, the men would have faced freezing water, exhaustion, and rapidly shifting currents. The chances of survival were therefore minimal. They likely succumbed to hypothermia, drowning, or injury within hours of escaping. For lead investigator Thomas Avery, the announcement is bittersweet. "This case has defined cold case work for our agency for over 50 years," he told reporters. "While the ending is not what some had hoped for, we are finally able to give the public some much-deserved clarity, closure, and confirmation." The case was closed, but the way they died and where they ended up told a story far more tragic than anyone expected. The truth beneath the waves. With the confirmation of the escapees' identities, attention immediately shifted to reconstructing the final fatal moments of Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers. After 6 decades of uncertainty, authorities were now able to piece together a timeline, not one built on rumor or speculation, but on hard forensic science, environmental modeling, and physical evidence recovered from the bay. According to the U.S. Marshal's final investigative report, the escape unfolded exactly as originally believed, at least in its early stages. Between 11:30 p.m. and midnight on June 11, 1962, the 3 men launched their homemade raft from the northern shoreline of Alcatraz. Made from over 50 rubber raincoats stitched together and sealed with heat and adhesives, the raft had no light source, no navigation system, and no guarantees. But it was designed for one purpose only: speed and silence. The planned catch tide was a successful one. Historical tide records said that at that time, the current was flowing towards Angel Island, thus creating a very tight window during which the raft could be dragged northward. The 3 men paddled with makeshift oars, one of which was later found to be floating near the island. For a while, it all looked good for the escape. The raft held, the current was favorable, and the guards were obliviously clueless about what had happened. But then, the bay struck back. New simulations conducted by the NOAA and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers suggest that the currents here reversed as the men approached the rocky shore of Angel Island. Here, the underwater terrain is shallow and jagged, hence notoriously hazardous. Steep boulders submerged into the waters and narrow coves create unpredictable eddies, spots that could easily lock in a craft, especially one as fragile as a patchwork raft. That is where the evidence suggests the raft simply either stalled or capsized. Shattered remains of rubber flotation recovered in 2025 bore stress tears and punctures consistent with impact against sharp rocks. A nearby broken paddle was supportive of the struggle theory. This was no slow heel-to-heel sinking. It was a catastrophic failure. From this point, the remains tell the rest. Frank Morris's skeleton had blunt force trauma to the skull consistent with hitting a rock or a hard surface. The forensic experts would like to believe that he was thrown off the raft, hitting his head against some object in the dark before he could swim towards help. Clarence, one of the Anglin brothers, had several broken ribs, perhaps caused by trying to cling onto driftwood, or after having pulled himself up the jagged shoreline, he succumbed to the elements. John Anglin got identified as one whose body bore no signs of any trauma. The investigators believed that he died of cold and exhaustion while swimming or just after entering the water. The water temperature that evening was a chilly 50 to 54 degrees Fahrenheit. Hypothermia could have set in after only 15 minutes. The men had no thermal gear, no backup flotation, and no means of signaling for help. Once the raft failed, they found themselves stranded in a hostile place. Their required would-be superhuman stamina, and even if they could pull that off, then fortune would need to look down favorably upon them. Concerning the most tragic aspect, the remains were in a position where all 3 men were located together one last time. They were placed in a sediment-sealed inlet close to each other, buried under debris and silt that must have formed over the decades. They hadn't moved far from where they had died. Nature swallowed their story whole. and it was kept buried just out of reach until a freak storm changed the coastline in 2025. For hundreds of years, say others, the myth persisted because there were no bodies. These men had gone, witnesses say, into history, gone into Brazil, gone into the vast unknowable. But the truth was much simpler and far sadder. The escape was there. The planning was excellent. The risk was gigantic. But it is not enough. If the answers were hidden so close for so long, what else has been missed in plain sight? Closure or cover-up? For the first time in over 6 decades, authorities claimed to have concrete answers. The bodies of Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers were recovered, identified, and the case was officially closed. But not everyone accepted the ending so easily. Instead of universal relief, the revelation ignited something else entirely: doubt. Within hours of the press conference, news outlets across the country began running retrospectives. Old footage of the prison, archival interviews, and investigative specials resurfaced in a frenzy. Major networks rolled out panel discussions with criminologists, forensic experts, and former investigators. And that's when cracks started to show. Not in the science, but in the narrative. One of the first points of contention centered on the infamous 1975 photograph. For years, this image, allegedly taken in Brazil, had served as the strongest piece of circumstantial evidence that John and Clarence Anglin survived. It showed 2 men standing beside a truck on a rural farm, faces weathered but familiar. A family friend who claimed to have visited the Anglin brothers vouched for its authenticity. In 2020, facial recognition software even matched their craniofacial structure with a 96–97% probability. If these men have died near Angel Island, then what it does mean for the image shown, whether it is good misidentification, the deep fake of its date, or mere wishful thinking. As federal investigators say now, the photo is not consistent with confirmed forensic evidence. It means irrelevant. But to believers, this seemed a sidestep rather than a rebuttal. There was also the much-disputed letter of 2013, allegedly penned by John Anglin, only sent to the FBI. It claimed to have fallen sick and be willing to trade his name for medical treatment. The letter even claimed that he died in 2008, and Clarence in 2011. It was fingerprint and DNA tested, the results being inconclusive, yet convincing enough to keep the file live. Now, with the finding of the remains, officials have branded the missive a hoax, but skeptics have raised just that question. If the DNA cannot be matched with anyone else, why assume it is fake? Over the years, it became another target for disapproval. Hair samples, partial raft DNA, and personal effects had been stored by the U.S. Marshals since at least the late 1990s. What was it that set the date in 2025 for closing the case? The official line was that the technology had finally caught up. Next-generation DNA sequencing and AI reconstruction were the tools that simply weren't there yet. True, perhaps, but critics wanted to see a chain of custody and lab reports, peer reviews, anything and everything. Ken Whitner, one of the Anglin brothers' nephews, expressed that kind of doubt. If they found the bodies, then let's see the chain of custody. We're not doubting the science, we're asking for the full picture. This, however, was about more than loyalty or conspiracy for the families. For plenty of others, though, the story might be hinged on who has the right to call the ending. For many years, the Alcatraz escape had signified personal bravado, an unsolvable riddle for most. Some admired them for their courage, but others wondered about their skill. Everybody agreed on one thing, and it was, it's a mystery. While officials claimed that the case is closed, on the other hand, the public is left to wonder whether this means closure or coda inconvenient. Even with bones in the ground, not everyone believes the story is over, because key questions remain unanswered. Myth, memory, and the lasting legacy. With the Alcatraz escape mystery finally declared solved in 2025, A historic chapter closed. But what remained wasn't just a set of facts or a few recovered bones. It was a legend that had gripped imaginations for over 60 years. And legends don't vanish just because the evidence says they should. For decades, the story of Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers had been mythologized in books, films, and pop culture. Tour guides on Alcatraz recounted the daring escape with a wink, always ending on the same tantalizing note. Did they make it? That ambiguity made the escape timeless, etched into the fabric of American folklore alongside other great mysteries. Now, with federal officials confirming their deaths near Angel Island, the answer is finally, no, they didn't make it. And yet, for many, that certainty feels oddly unsatisfying. Not that he thought of them as inmates. The escape was not just to 3 people. Prison escape became something more. It became a symbol of possible defiance, of clever outwitting, of the powerful, such as the demonstration of humanity's unquenchable thirst for freedom. These men weren't violent slayers or sadistic criminals. They were clever, persistent, and desperate. An underdog tale wrapped in concrete walls and surrounded by cold, merciless water. Really, or none at all, their legacy lies in that which they dared to attempt. Handmade rafts, the most realistic hair dummies, tunnel systems scratch-built with spoons, and a plan executed so precisely that fools guards, avoids searchlights, and triggers a manhunt lasting decades. Even in failure, their awe-inspiring deed is known. Eventually, the escape began to stand for something larger. Now it became a canvas for projection. It reminded the disillusioned that authority can be challenged, the adventurers and romantics that freedom, albeit for a time, was worth any risk. Hope, though, for their families. But in fact, the 2025 discovery does not obliterate this history. Instead, it shapes it anew. Now it becomes heartbreakingly clear. They very nearly made it. They didn't just drown precisely after launching, they actually got off the island. They fought the tide. They nearly reached the rocky edge of a second chance. In turn, that near miss only strengthens their legend, changing speculation into what is now a human tragedy of grit, undone by nature. Alcatraz tours have already rehashed the scripts. Endings no longer conclude with an open-ended question. Now, guides explain forensic evidence as well as point out the cove where the bodies were found. Interest, though curious, does not seem to dampen in the escape. In fact, it is increasing. Bookstores report additional sales in Alcatraz-relevant nonfiction. A new docuseries is underway. Podcast episodes that are dedicated to the 2025 update have also gone viral. Even with the closure, curiosity knows no bounds. And that is perhaps the greatest legacy of the escape. Not just the event, but the way it muddied definitions of history and myth, fact and folklore. It taught us how much power a question can hold, how the absence of an answer can embolden generations of storytellers, detectives, and dreamers. Was it a brilliant plan that fell short, or a story rewritten by time and politics? Let us know what you believe in the comments. Subscribe for more deep-dive investigations like this, and watch the next video to see how one forgotten letter reshaped another cold case.